I want to start first, though, with my colleague Rachel Maddow, host of MS Now's The Rachel Maddow Show. Rachel, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show. You've been following this all morning. What do you make of this? It's a very, very big development in a months-long effort against Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested to hear what the president has to say in his remarks from the White House that are planned for just a little under an hour from now. Ali, I feel like in your heart of hearts, when you think about what the United States just did, I think there are very few Americans right now who have any idea why the United States did this. If this was about drug trafficking, then why did President Trump just pardon the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of sending hundreds of tons of drugs into the United States? If this was about something about the illegitimacy of Maduro's election, well, that's something that the U.S. is, decrying any other country policing. We just sanctioned Brazil for having tried to protect itself from a coup by its former president, Jair Bolsonaro. I mean, if it's about gangs, we had the president of El Salvador, who is believed by U.S. law enforcement to be very linked with the notorious gang MS-13, which has caused incredible damage in the hemisphere, including in the United States. He's invited into the Oval Office, and the president says that he's looking forward to sending homegrown Americans to that president's essentially, jungle concentration camps. So all of the purported explanations for what's happened here don't stand up to logical scrutiny. The president has never articulated a coherent rationale for having done this. This seems like Marco Rubio's dream, not Donald Trump's dream. So I'll be very interested to hear what the president is able to piece together in terms of an articulable rationale for having done this. That said, he's done it. And so, in the immortal words of General Colin Powell, you break it, you own it. And it's one thing to do that on the other side of the world. It's another thing to do that so close to home here in our hemisphere. I don't know if they have any plan for what to do now that they have invaded, bombed, and removed the president of that country. But I'll be happy to hear an America First rationale for it, whatever it is.
And the administration kind of sort of laid a little bit of it out in its national security strategy that it came out with a little while ago, this whole concept, sort of a renewal of the Monroe Doctrine, that what happens in our hemisphere is our business and what happens elsewhere is someone else's business. That said, this is the interesting question. Donald Trump wanted to get rid of Maduro in his first term. Marco Rubio, as you said, is very determined to have gotten rid of Maduro and says that there's nothing else to happen now that they've got him. The question is what happens, because Venezuela is a tricky country, and we don't necessarily know what the plan is hereafter.
Exactly. I mean, the president in his remarks on Fox and Friends this morning, which is still just an astonishing choice by a president to have done this before he formally addresses the nation. He called into Fox and Friends and effused about how he felt like he was watching a television show when he was watching the feed of what was going on there, which is it's just disheartening to have a president who has that kind of a mindset about these things. But he also said, essentially sort of ad-libbing, trying to explain why this was a good thing, that, in Venezuela, he was essentially a dictator, as if that was the justification for the United States going in there and physically removing the president of that country. I mean, nobody thinks that Maduro is a good guy or has a lot of confidence in the way that he was holding on to power. But again, the president of El Salvador calls himself, the world's coolest dictator, or whatever it is, that phrase is that he uses for himself. There's lots of countries around the world with de facto, arguable, or official dictatorships. If it is now the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that we invade and remove the leadership of every country where that's true, it's going to be a very different term in office, and it's going to be a very different world than the one that America First Donald Trump ran on. I mean, the whole justification for J.D. Vance's selection onto the vice presidential ticket was supposedly his distaste for and commitment against America getting involved in regime change wars. And now here's J.D. Vance out tweeting about this, again, before the president speaks to the nation about it, pounding his chest about how awesome this is. It's just whatever you thought you were buying when you bought this presidency, this was not what they had on offer.
So there are a few issues here that you bring up. The perceived illegitimacy of the Maduro government. Fair enough. The idea that he's an authoritarian, also fair enough. We don't often succeed in the second part of this, the regime change part, but it's not even obvious that that's happened. For instance, we're getting reporting that the vice president of Venezuela may be in Russia at this point. But this isn't necessarily regime change. This is the capturing of Maduro, who will be arraigned in New York and a trial. But we're not sure that we got regime change. And there's those who argue that probably shouldn't be a goal of ours anyway, because sometimes we end up getting mired. As you said, you broke it, you bought it. Venezuela is a country of 28 million people, many of whom are impoverished with out of control inflation. We may have just bought ourselves a big problem.
Yeah. I mean, part of the idea of you break it, you bought it, the Pottery Barn rule problem, right, for wars that we got involved with in the Middle East and in landlocked Central Asia, was that we were setting off chains of events and generational consequences in a region that were eventually going to have blowback throughout that region and maybe even here. But when you're talking about our own hemisphere, once you start doing that here, I mean, we already are incredibly intertwined in terms of our fates with Central and South America. All of the Donald Trump agenda about immigration is driven at core by conditions in countries, in many cases in Central and South America, that drive migration flows to this country for people who are looking for a better life. Well, if we're going to start invading and removing the presidents of countries in Central and South America, that is going to not exactly be a stabilizing factor in terms of what happens with migration flows, with economic integration, with gangs, with with transnational cartel behavior, with drug flows. Again, like if we felt that the Trump administration was full of the most sober, prudent technocrats in the world, right? If they really were the best and brightest in an unironic sense, this would be an incredibly risky thing to do. But instead, it's these guys. And, you know, if you trust the former Fox and Friends weekend host, who's now our defense secretary, to be managing what may be an open-ended commitment here, to manage the fallout from what we have just started and apparently have set the precedent that we're willing to do anywhere. You know, I congratulate you. I don't think a lot of Americans, even Americans who are celebrating the end of Maduro's regime, I don't think a lot of people have a lot of confidence in the Trump administration as it's currently constituted to manage what may be a fairly wild series of consequences here. And
by the way, even if you did have faith, historically, when we've gotten involved in regime change, you know, two things can happen. You can either stabilize a country and a region through regime change, or you can destabilize it. More often than not, we've destabilized it. Even when sober people are in charge of the operation. You bring up an important point that people have been talking about this, or this administration has been referring to Venezuela as a source of drugs. They did the same thing with Canada. It's not entirely accurate. But more importantly, the immigration issue. Venezuela is so destabilized. If it becomes more destabilized, what it does is it causes, Colombia has seen this, Colombia is moving troops to its border because they're expecting an outflow of asylum seekers and refugees who also try and make it to the United States. Yeah. And again, like, what exactly is the rationale here for these actions? I mean, consider Brazil, right? I mean, Brazil had a sort of Trump-ish authoritarian leader in Jair Bolsonaro who tried to pull off the same kind of effort at a coup that President Trump tried on January 6th. It didn't succeed. He was prosecuted, and the U.S. has now sanctioned Brazil in punishment for having tried to protect its election system from an effort at violent overthrow. Now, if the idea is that Venezuela deserved this bombing and invasion and the removal of its president because of an unfair election there, or because of a contested election there, or because of the dictatorial rule of Maduro, well, you know, okay, now do Brazil. You know, why would we be taking completely opposite takes on these pretextual issues with different South American and Central American countries? How do you have the MS-13 linked president of El Salvador in the U.S. Oval Office with that, you know, with all of the
the pledges of friendship and us sending people from the United States into one of his prisons if the issue is gangs? How do you have the Honduran former president pardoned inexplicably by Donald Trump after he put some of Trump's friends on his payroll, after that guy was convicted of smuggling hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States? I mean, none of what we have learned, I think, for multiple administrations, for multiple bad foreign policy decisions in our country, is that when the things they are saying are the reasons for their actions are proven to not be the reasons for their actions, you have to ask yourself what it's really for. And in this case, I hope we learn something real about that from this president this hour.
Colonel Jack was talking to me before we started the show, and one of the points that he was making is that when pressuring a country, whether you are wanting to achieve regime change or some sort of stability, there's usually a mix of diplomatic and economic action and perhaps the threat of military action. This has been a very unusual situation. We have 15,000 troops off of the coast of Venezuela. We've got an aircraft carrier strike group. We've got F-35s in Puerto Rico. This is set up to be a very big military action. Now, Marco Rubio says that's probably done with. They've got Maduro, and I don't know whether that means the boats all turn back. But this has not been... There was more headroom available on the diplomatic front and the economic front. And Donald Trump did say that Maduro was prepared to talk and that they were talking and that there was some possibility of a surrender. We're not quite sure how this all happened because they're talking about a capture, that they dragged him out of his bedroom. There's a way this could have worked out differently.
Yes, absolutely. And again, we don't know the justification for the action overall. We also don't know the justification for these tactics in particular, for this type of action, this type of raid and seizure of that country's leader, the way that we've seen it. And maybe we will get that explanation from the president. We shall see. But I mean, stepping back from this a little bit, Ali, I also think, I'm cognizant of what we have been talking about for the last year since Trump has been back in office and what type of leader he appears to want to be. And he is not unique. He is not, this is not the first sort of iteration of this type of leader we have seen around the world. And one thing that we know about this type of sort of would-be strongman is that questions of legality and illegality are ones that he... that may play differently for him than they would for a non-strongman leader. For example, I think that to the extent that this can be defined in the United States as having been an illegal action, I actually think Trump will see that as a political plus, and he will lean into that. He will not care about, not only will he not care about people saying this is illegal, he'll see that as an asset and he'll want to play that up. I also think that would-be strongmen and authoritarian leaders like to start wars. They like to start wars, I think, both for ego and sense of purpose, but also because they like the expanded powers that war tends to give leaders domestically at home against their own political opponents.
Even though he says he doesn't. He says that's not his thing, right? He's still jockeying for that Nobel Peace Prize nomination.
Yeah. It's hard to get a Nobel Peace Prize when you're starting wars and invading other countries. But, I suppose if anybody thinks he can do it, it's probably President Trump.
One of the things that David Rode, who's with us this morning, was pointing out is that it's not clear yet, but it does seem like congressional authorization was not sought for this action. But that's par for the course, to your point, right? Donald Trump, if he thinks the law is in his way as it relates to military action, Congress is where that law is, where you bump up against that law. So he may not be as troubled by it. But this morning, we're hearing from members of Congress, we'll have some on the show, and from members of the Senate from both parties who feel that the bombing of those boats off of Venezuela was illegal and that this may itself be illegal. That used to be relevant. That used to be a big conversation that would occupy a lot of our thought. Seems to just play a smaller role these days.
Yeah, two things. One is that I think a lot of previous presidents have broken those rules, and so we inherit from President George H.W. Bush and Pam. All right, like we inherit from George W. Bush in terms of his invasion. Right, we inherit a presidential sense of entitlement around war powers that is totally unjustified by the Constitution. This is what I wrote my first book about. But it's something that's been eroding for a long time, this idea that Congress controls whether or not we go to war. And I sincerely hope that in my lifetime we will get back to the founders' vision of who's supposed to declare war and how we're supposed to do it. But Donald Trump won't be the one to have broken that. But on a second point, Ali, I really feel like what we've seen with the boat strikes and what we've seen with the president's domestic agenda is that if he had a choice to do this within the law or a choice to do it blatantly flouting the law, he would choose the latter. Because I think he thinks that makes him seem strong, and because I think he thinks that essentially doesn't just break the law in the sense of violating the law, it breaks the law in terms of its ability to constrain him in the future. And I think that this president does not feel bound by the laws established by the United States Congress, nor does he particularly feel bound by the rulings of most U.S. courts. And so I think that he'll see illegality in this case as a plus. And he will hope that the debate domestically about what he's just done is about the constitutionality of his actions, because I think he'd proudly proclaim that he's acting outside the Constitution and hope to turn that to political capital in a sort of strongman narrative that he's so obviously enamored of in this second term.